From the majestic heights of the Taurus Mountains to the vast deserts of Mesopotamia, the ancient Near East revered and feared the mighty powers that ruled the skies. Dive with us into the tempestuous tales of storm gods, where mythology meets history.
Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor can tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Daniel Schwemer. We're going to be talking about the characteristics and what is a storm god in the ancient Near East. We're going to talk about the cutting edge scholarship. We've got a great scholar on here today who can give us the lay of the land and help us understand, what they thought of gods in the ancient times. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm very well. Hi, Zach. Very good to
Awesome.
be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, it's an absolute pleasure. This is a topic I've been wanting to study for a long time. So, just tell us the audience about your background. Where are you from? What scholarship you've written on? Your
Yeah,
education, all that.
yeah. I'm a professor of ancient Eastern studies at Würzburg University in the south of Germany. I studied in Germany, and then throughout my career, I worked for at German universities and also in London at the School of Oriental and African Studies before returning to Germany, where I'm now a professor here at Würzburg University. I'm a specialist for cuneiform texts, especially from the second and first millennia BC. And my specific areas of expertise are, on the one hand, Mesopotamia, so basically the area of modern Iraq, eastern Syria, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I've been working a lot on Hittite texts from a culture in central Anatolia, so in modern Turkey, which has also produced a significant amount of cuneiform texts and is one of the big cultures of the second millennium ancient Near East, next to Babylonia, Assyria, the Mitanni Empire, the Hittite Empire
Mm,
is one of these global players of that age.
mm,
And one of my special interests in these various periods and cultures is the history of religions in the ancient Near East. And well, my interest in storm gods goes back a very long time. That was the topic of my PhD dissertation, now more than 20 years ago, I have to say. And another topic that I've been working on for many years are ritual texts from various sites in Babylonia and Assyria, especially magical rituals that were used, um, especially to fight illness that was
mm,
conceived of as demons or witchcraft and things like that.
mm. Very, very cool. Okay. So, for those that aren't familiar, could you give my audience just the general characteristics of storm gods in the ancient Near East?
Yeah, storm gods are one of this type of deity that you find in all periods and areas of the ancient East, because all humans there and now experience fairly regularly the occurrence of storms, rain, thunder, winds, strong winds, dust storms, etc. And so, similarly to sun deities, solar deities, moon gods, or the Venus goddess, storm gods are found really across the board throughout all periods of the ancient Near Eastern history and in all regions. Though we tend to see that in those areas of the Middle East where rainfall plays an important role for agriculture, uh, this storm god, whatever his name then is, in these specific areas, plays a very important role and often is then considered the king of the divine world. And that makes it fascinating because that is something that is typical for storm gods in the second half of the second millennium and in the first millennium in Upper
Mm-hmm.
Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia. And of course, this is also the region that is very much in contact with what we call the world of the Bible, and also the ancient Greek culture, and so that there are contacts to be observed, and that makes it a fascinating topic.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So, Why would you say we should study just a specific type of deity like the storm god rather than just individual storm gods or
Yeah,
individual gods that are popular?
actually, you could approach it, of course, in a way that you say, I'm interested in, let's say, the Hittite storm god, who we know was called Tahuna by the Hittites. And so I write a book and I do research on Tahuna and no other god. But it is interesting to observe, on the one hand, that due probably to the natural phenomena this type of god was associated with, you can see that storm gods are similar in all the regions. They are all male gods, usually youngish male gods who are warlike, reflecting the violence of the storm. Of course, they're in charge of bringing rain and fertility to the fields and so on. So there are parallels in the text how these gods are described. And now we observe these similarities when we study the ancient texts. But actually, the ancients themselves also observed these similarities. And we have theological texts, for example, from Babylonia, lists of gods that in several columns list gods from one tradition, and another in another column gods from another tradition, and they identify various gods of various names with each other. And the
Hmm.
criteria they use are mainly typological. So they recognized actually the god that the Sumerians in modern southern Iraq called Ishkur is very similar to our god Adat that we worship more towards the north in Mesopotamia. And so these deities were associated with each other and merged. Actually, some of them really merged, others were just connected. So, in a way, by taking a typological approach and taking into account deities of more than one name of the same type, we
Hmm.
follow the traces actually of our sources. And on the other hand, of course, these regions, especially in the second millennium, first millennium, were highly interconnected, and there are mutual influences which you will not observe if you focus only very narrowly on one text tradition, one language, one
Hmm.
specific god.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So let's see here. Could you talk about the specific names of
Yeah,
the more popular storm deities as well as their location, time,
yeah.
what are they famous for, stuff like that.
Yeah, some of these names will sound very familiar to many of your listeners, and some entirely strange. Um, Maybe I begin with those that might, or one that might sound a bit familiar. That is a god that bears a Semitic name, Hadar, in the oldest sources, and is then well known under various variants of the same name as Hadu, Adu, Adat, and then Hadat. And in the form Hadat, this Semitic storm god is well known, for example, from Aramaic sources, and is also mentioned in texts from Ugarit and in the Bible. So that might sound familiar, and it also occurs actually in Greek and Latin sources under that name later on.
Hmm.
But behind this name, Adat, he was called in Babylonia, is probably the most widespread and varied storm god of the ancient Near East that we know. We cannot trace the origins of this god exactly, but it is already attested in the mid third millennium BC in Syria, in cuneiform texts from Ebla in today in northern Syria, and is then the main name of the Babylonian storm god in Babylonia and Assyria, so in Mesopotamia, in the area of modern Iraq, from the third millennium down to the end of cuneiform culture in the first century BC, first century CE, and is then also attested still in later sources. And it's based on the name is based on a Semitic uh, root Hadat, that means to thunder. So from early on, this is the god of thunder, and this name is present in many regions of the ancient East throughout uh, 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 all periods, really. But
Mm,
specifically, um, Adat is the name of the Babylonian storm god in many of the literary sources that you might associate with ancient Babylonian culture. And in Babylonia, in the south of modern Iraq, this god Adat, Semitic storm god, was identified with a god that the Sumerians worshipped there also from time immemorial. Really, we don't know for how long, but it certainly goes back uh, beyond the beginning of the third millennium BC, a god called Ishkur. And Ishkur was the Sumerian storm god, a
mm,
very destructive god associated with also with dust storms, but also associated with the rain in the winter and spring that makes the steppe bloom. So one, even in the south of Iraq, people know, of course, about rain and its effects on nature. And Ishkur and Adat merge into one god,
mm,
really, in Mesopotamian history. And often we use a double-barreled name for him, call him Ishkur Adat, because Sumerian and Akkadian culture go so closely together in this bilingual area of the ancient Near East.
mm,
Another name that I'm sure sounds familiar to many is Baal, or Baalu in the earlier period, uh, literally the Lord. And this Semitic word for Lord, Baal, uh, became the name of a storm god on the Mediterranean coast in what is today Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, in that area, probably around in the mid second millennium BC, and then probably developed from an epithet, a byname, into the main name of the storm god, which was
mm,
then not called Adat anymore, or Hadar in that area, but Baal. And as such, we meet Baal in the Bible, but we also in the text from Ugarit, in the cuneiform text from Ugarit, and also especially in Phoenician culture in first millennium, the god Baal, and then also a god called Baal of the heavens, Baal Shamim, plays a very prominent role as the king uh, of the gods. So who do we have now? Adat, Ishkur, and Baal. Uh, Probably the one god that we should still mention is Tahuna or Tahunta. Again, various forms of the name are attested. Well, one of the uh, who is the Anatolian storm god, the storm god that the Hittites venerated in central Anatolia, modern Turkey. And to complete the confusion, there's yet another important name in the mix, a god called Teshub. And Teshub was the Hurrian storm god,
mm,
and we know about him from especially the region of Upper Mesopotamia, from the um, uh, uh, around the late third millennium onwards, but probably that god also has an older history in Hurrian culture before it arrived in Mesopotamia itself. And this god Teshub uh, also has in Hurrian religious tradition the role of a divine king who rules the world of the gods, and is even in one Hurrian text he's called the god of the gods. Uh, so a very eminent position. One of the traditions where the storm god, a storm god, has a very prominent position in the pantheon uh, and religious traditions or in that language and region.
mm. Yeah, yeah, that's good stuff. So let's see here. Um, in the Bible, it does, or maybe the New Testament, the Gospels, it does mention like Baal Zebub.
Mhm.
Do you know much about that, like where that came from?
Yeah. Well, I don't know the latest literature on that, I have to admit, but that there are many combinations, divine names that begin with Baal and then
Mm,
have an epithet or city's name with it, and they do not necessarily um, uh, uh, go back to specific storm gods. The storm god
mm,
adopted the name Baal as his personal name, so to say,
mm,
in that area. But Baal Zebub, and Zebub is connected with flies, and but that is originally the right interpretation. Probably scholars are divided about that, but you would have to ask an Old Testament scholar about this. Uh, but only because a god is called Baal, you cannot take for granted that it is part of that tradition of storm gods, because Baal
mm,
basically means Lord, and any god can be called Lord of his city,
mm. Yeah.
and so I wouldn't necessarily immediately say, yeah, because
Mm.
Baal Zebub has Baal in it, it must be a storm god originally. That might lead you astray. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Okay. All right. So, where do we get these texts? What kind of texts do we have that give us this information about the practices,
Yeah.
how they worshipped these gods?
Yeah. The in the third millennium, second millennium, and also throughout the first millennium, our most important textual sources are written in the cuneiform script in the ancient Near East, on various materials, sometimes on stone, sometimes on metal, but the main medium is clay. So we mainly what I'm working on are clay tablets that are inscribed in the cuneiform script that originated in southern Mesopotamia
Mm,
in the late fourth millennium, but became like Latin writing is our shared writing system across many parts of the world today. So in the ancient Near East, cuneiform was used not only for the languages of Mesopotamia, but for many other languages as well. So many of the sources that we have to look at when we study storm gods, whether they come from Hittite Anatolia or from the Mitanni Empire in Upper Mesopotamia or from the Mediterranean coast or from southern Iraq. They all look very similar, actually, at first sight. They are all clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, but they are written in different languages of those regions and
mm,
preserve all kinds of texts. And of course, when we study religious traditions, when we study the profile of a deity and the cult of a deity, we first think uh, about narrative texts, mythological texts that tell stories about these gods, and they are very important sources. Or ritual texts that describe the cult, calendar, and specific festivities at a
mm,
certain temple and give us insight also into what was recited in the cult of that temple, which ideas were associated with the deity in that context. Um, and of course, part of the cult in the temple, but also in a more private settings, is devotional literature, prayers, hymns, and especially those give usually in the opening passage, just as you know it from the Psalms, they give you a very vivid picture about the ideas and concepts that were associated with the deity that is invoked in that specific prayer or hymn.
mm,
So these are very important sources for us that really give direct information on the profile of a specific deity in various regions and periods. Uh, but it's not only those texts that we first associate with religious traditions that are important, but temples also had administrative texts, and it is also interesting to see because it sheds light on the position of the god in a pantheon, how important the temple was for the economy, the politics of a certain area. Uh, what other things were done in the temple? Is the temple maybe also a place where divination is conducted, where law is administered. All these things may not be reflected in the religious texts in the narrow sense, but uh, um, might be glimpsed or seen in administrative documents, in legal documents, in letters. And all these texts have to be examined down to personal names, which uh, you and your listeners are well familiar with Hebrew names. Often they have El in them, like Raphael and so on. They have divine names in them. And
Mm,
ancient Near Eastern names generally are often what we call theophoric names, names that have a divine name in them, now basically a short prayer
mm,
or a short thanksgiving after the birth of the child. And it's also interesting to see how many people in a population carry which deity in their name. At least it gives you an information on how well known that deity was. If
mm.
half of the population carries a god in their name, then clearly uh, this seems to have been an important deity. So there are uh, quite a number of sources that we would not think of directly as relevant to the topic, but which still have
Mhm.
to be examined and sometimes give interesting information.
Mm, very interesting. Now, these texts are they just, being found in the ground, someone randomly digging them up? Are they like in the open and someone just randomly walks by it? How do they find these texts?
Yeah, cuneiform texts uh, have survived really only when they were written on a durable material
Mm,
and were somewhere in the ground where they had an environment that made the clay tablet uh, or let the clay tablet survive. So
mm,
um, usually these tablets are, or they're exclusively found in the ground, ideally in controlled archaeological excavations.
mm,
Unfortunately, uh, often also by illegal digging,
mm,
and they end up in museums, ideally public museums that are accessible to research, unfortunately, also in private collections that are more or less open to research.
mm,
And it's one of the largest text corpora that we have from the ancient world. Many, many
mhm,
thousands of clay tablets have been found since the the research into the ancient East in that sense began in the uh, mid 19th century, and since then, many thousands of clay tablets have been found. And we are so few specialists reading cuneiform that we haven't caught up at all. So there are thousands of fragments and tablets sitting in the large collections around the world. Uh, so you have collections of the oldest collection is certainly the British Museum in London.
mm,
In the US, you have famous collections at the universities, especially in Yale and in Philadelphia. You have large cuneiform collections. Then in other European museums, Berlin and in the Louvre in Paris, but of course also in the Middle Eastern capitals, in the national museums, especially in Istanbul, a very old traditional museum for
mm,
ancient Near Eastern artifacts, but also in Ankara, in Baghdad, in Damascus, and all these collections house clay tablets. And every year, every season, new cuneiform tablets are found, have to be
mm,
deciphered, documented, and ideally published, and then also change our picture of ancient Eastern history,
yeah.
sometimes also of the storm gods. Um, yeah, from time to time. And sometimes they add nuances or they give a fuller picture of something which we knew in principle, but it's a field where you really get surprises, and one text can really make pretty fundamental changes to
Mm,
what was the received opinion up to that point.
mm. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. The idea of, you know, any day we could find something that could change how we previously thought is just really fascinating. So, What would you? How would you say these gods are? How would you say these gods are depicted in art and reliefs?
Hmm. Yeah, the storm god is easy to recognize when you and it's actually also similar throughout periods. Usually, it's always a male god,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
usually shown standing up in a warlike pose with the arm raised in a smiting posture. Well, and there are several gods that are shown like that, but when you see a bull in the vicinity, either the god standing on the bull or this god standing on a chariot that is pulled by two bulls, then you can be pretty certain that you have one of the storm gods in front of you, because that
Hmm,
was the pattern how they were depicted in the second and first millennium in
hmm,
throughout Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, um, and um, the with a pair of bulls or one bull the god is standing on, and in his raised arm the storm god usually has a weapon. That weapon can be a whip, especially in Babylonia that is attested, a whip that symbolizes at the same time thunder, because the crack of the whip gives you the sound of thunder, and also the lash of the whip is like lightning. Um, More common in Upper Mesopotamia and Syria and Anatolia is a mace or an axe. Sometimes also a bundle of lightning is attested, often then in the left hand. So the individual storm gods then have their own traditions, pictorial traditions, iconographic traditions,
hmm,
but these are features that you find again and again, and then in various forms. You can find it in on cylinder seals, which are tiny, were used for sealing documents and had little scenes engraved of them in them. And you see it in huge monumental statues that give you a three-dimensional picture of the god on his chariot with the bull-drawn wagon. Different from
hmm,
that is the ancient tradition associated with Sumerian Ishkur. His wagon or chariot is not pulled by bulls, but by a lion dragon. So by a mixed creature, partly lion, partly a dragon, that symbolized the storm.
hmm,
And literary texts describe how the chariot of Ishkur is pulled by several storm demons, and they were imagined as water spouting lion dragons. And then sometimes in Mesopotamia, because the tradition, the association with the bull also came to Mesopotamia. Sometimes you have bulls and lion dragons combined for a certain period of time, but the bull then becomes dominant very much. And
hmm,
the bull was certainly associated with the storm god from very early on, because the storm god tramples across the heavens in the storm like a bull that tramples over a field. And also, if you imagine a big black bull is a bit like a big black storm approaching, and the bull is one with the lion the most powerful land animal, and that
hmm,
speaks to the prominent position and comparative strength of the storm god in these
hmm,
uh, religious traditions.
hmm. So what about the idea of standing on the bull? Does that what is that supposed to be conveying?
Hmm. In contrast to
Well, I mean, they could just be
yeah,
depicting the actual god. They don't have to
yeah,
depict the bull. So what you mentioned the noises, and that how that's similar to storms. Is all that is like they just assumed, hey, there
yeah,
must be a bull up there because and he must be riding the bull because that's what the noise makes, or
yeah.
how does that come about, or what is that supposed to mean?
There are traditions where the storm god is himself imagined as a bull
Oh, okay.
and also depicted just as a bull. But
Mm,
what becomes dominant is the what we call anthropomorphic concept, that like all other deities, or most other deities, the storm god was imagined to basically be like a human being, just much bigger and much stronger. So the shape of human but divine. And the bull then, the animal becomes an attribute, something that accompanies the god, and also a symbol of the god. And then there are different ways in art to combine a deity, and these can be different deities that have different animals that are associated with them. And sometimes they can be draft animals on pulling a chariot, but very often deities. And also we know that from depictions of cult statues, were depicted as standing on their animal as a mount, basically. And yeah, the storm god is not, and other deities as well, is not depicted like a cowboy riding riding a bull, but the bull is standing still, and the storm god is standing erect on the bull.
Hmm.
That becomes a sort of pedestal in that iconography.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. I would assume that they didn't literally stand on bulls back then, right?
Well, well, yes and no.
Okay.
So what we do know, but we actually don't know whether it's associated with the storm god specifically.
Uh-huh.
There are, well, during cult festivals, we know that um, all kinds of performances took place:
Okay.
music, dance, and so on.
Uh-huh.
And there was a tradition where you didn't dance with a bull, but you would leap over a bull or do acrobatics with a bull leaping. And that is actually attested in Anatolia and also in Crete. And we don't have texts that clearly associate that acrobatic or performance tradition with the cult of the storm god. On the other hand, the association of the bull with the storm god was so prevalent in these cultures
Mm-hmm.
that I wouldn't exclude that the people back then also made these connections.
Hmm.
But that looks then also in the depictions of this bull leaping, that looks very different from the storm god standing majestically
Yeah.
on his strong bull.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So you have the art depictions and you have the actual text that talk about the specific gods. Does the art give us any type of extra information that we didn't know from the texts that, like previously? Um, hmm, what's a better way to put it? Let's see. Uh, do they allow us to trace the history of the storm gods into prehistoric times?
Yeah, that is a fascinating question that I struggled with. I have to admit, because um, we we do have the texts from the about the mid third millennium onwards that describe various storm gods. We do have at the same time this iconographic evidence, the pictures and statues and so on, and we know from the texts and from those and that iconographic evidence about the close association between the ideas and images associated with the storm god and the animal of the wild bull.
Hmm.
And if we go further back in time, in the ancient Near East into the prehistoric periods, we see that in the iconography of those periods, so down into the fourth, fifth, sixth millennium BC and earlier,
Hmm.
uh, actually down to the Neolithic, the bulls play an important role, and bulls' horns play an important role in the iconography in what are probably cultic installations, and most
Hmm.
famously, the installations of bull horns in the Neolithic village of Çatalhöyük in southeastern Turkey. And there was always the question: what does that actually mean? What do these bucrania, also on pottery you find them, bull's horns, what do they mean to these to the people in these prehistoric periods? And and there are two ways to approach this. One is to be methodologically very rigid and to say we we, we must not uh, uh, take, and I think that is entirely justified to be methodologically rigid. We must not take texts that are a thousand or several thousands years later and put them side by side with prehistoric iconographic evidence and say,
Hmm.
well, this what we have in the text here 5,000 years later is the same that we have
Yeah.
here in the prehistoric art. And so it's methodologically certainly appropriate to interpret, first of all, these depictions of bulls and bulls' horns and the use of them in the context of the prehistoric iconography that we find, and that does not only include bull's horns but also other animals, uh, and and shows that these societies very much were embedded in their environment. They of course recognized the strength of certain animals, and that was interpreted in the context of religious traditions and associated with numinous powers and probably also with deities. But we cannot describe this concretely because we lack the texts that really give us the concrete information on this.
Hmm.
So on the one hand, but on the one hand, one would not like to connect that directly. On the other hand, I find it unlikely that the association with the storm as a natural phenomenon and the bull is something that popped up in the mid third millennium and didn't exist beforehand. Because things that are attested in texts up to, from a certain period of time, uh, there's no reason to assume that they were invented at the same time. Is rather plausible, especially for religious traditions, to assume that they have a longer history, reaching back into periods that we that are inaccessible via texts to us.
Hmm.
Um, and so I and also the storm god Hadar, we do not know exactly since when he was present in Upper Mesopotamia
Hmm.
and northern Syria, but certainly before we find him in texts from Ebla, but maybe not already contemporary to the Neolithic village in Çatalhöyük. And all these granular religious traditions through these many centuries that of the prehistoric periods are largely inaccessible to us.
Hmm.
Uh, but we should recognize that what we have in the text emerged from this very certainly from these traditions, which were certainly as complex as we find them later in the texts.
Hmm. Yeah. So, in regards to family and court, could you one explain those terms to people not familiar, how this relates to storm gods? But additionally, what gods are associated with these storm gods, typically in the ancient Near East?
Yeah, uh, we talked already about the about deities being imagined like to be like humans, to be human
Mm-hmm.
shaped, to be anthropomorphic. And if you imagine a deity not in a theomorphic as an animal or not as an abstract symbol or something that is not concrete, a flash of light or something like that, if you imagine a deity to be like a human being, only not human, much stronger, omnipresent, very old, and of course also not, at least not mortal in the human sense. There are dead gods, but gods do not die in the sense humans die. Uh, but if in principle you make this analogy, then part of this analogy is that, of course, like a human king, the divine king, whether he's called Teshub or Tahuna or Hada. The divine king is not sitting alone on his throne, but he has at his side a wife, he has servants, he has weapons, he has a chariot, he has draft animals for that chariot, he has a house, which is the temple. And because he's a god, he can have several temples and be in all of them at the same time. That's one of the tricks only gods can do. Humans fail to do that to this day. And there are cuneiform sources that explain that this is one of the hallmarks of divinity, to be present in more than one temple at a time. But part of this anthropomorphic picture of the deity is also a sociomorphic picture that, like we humans do not live alone, also the gods live in a divine society where they are embedded in a hierarchy, where each god has a family and servants and a stable with draft animals. And so also all these storm gods have relations to other deities. And if we take one famous storm god who had several different names throughout the ages, the storm god who was venerated in Aleppo, modern Aleppo. Many of your listeners will have seen in the recent terrible earthquake in southern Turkey and northern Syria. And they will have seen pictures of the citadel of the modern city of Aleppo, where the citadel wall partly collapsed. And this citadel that looks like a medieval castle now is actually one of the oldest religious places of worship for the storm god. Is attested from the mid-3rd millennium onwards as the place
Wow.
of his temple of the storm god. And the storm god of Aleppo was, through the ages, one of the storm gods who was known across various different ancient Eastern cultures. And from Iran, presents were sent to this god, and from Anatolia. And his cult was sort of worldwide known at that time. And at his side, as an example for the family, is a goddess called the one of Halab, the Chayabatu in the most ancient text. Later, her name turns into Chepat, but it basically means the Lady of Halab, the Lady of Aleppo. And the Lady of Aleppo was the wife of this storm god of Aleppo, who was called Hada in the 3rd millennium, and then later Adad or Tahuna or Teshub, depending on who talked to him in which language. And throughout these periods, we have Chepat as his wife, and he has the 2 bulls that draw his chariot, which in some traditions are called Jari and Khuri. And Jari and Khuri are then also gods of in their own right. And you can, of course, then also, like you do it in a royal court, you cannot always get direct access to the king. So you might want to talk to his bull, who might be easier to catch, and the bull then can talk to the king himself. So you talk this a bit like in Christian traditions, where you have saints, and in certain situations you invoke a saint and hope that the saint conveys your message to God. And in the same way, the court of a divine king in the ancient Near East had more lowly deities, servant deities, and so on, and wives and second wives, and a vizier, ministers, and they surrounded the god in the stories. They interact with this god in the stories that were told about this god. They were also venerated in the temple. They were worshipped in temple, had their own chapels and things like that. And then they played a role also in the religious practice, and often as intermediaries, which you would address because you didn't dare to address the king of the gods directly. And of course, these various characters then in the mythological stories, they play more or less prominent roles, but the stories wouldn't work if there was only one God. That's stories about just one God who cannot interact with other people, divine people,
Yeah.
um, are then become very abstract. Yeah.
Hmm. Interesting. So on the topic of stories, you've got some, more popular ones like Ishkor, warrior, destructive storm, fertile rain. There's myths about fight for kingship. There is storm gods, and they go to the netherworld, or dying and rising gods. Could you talk about some of the more popular
Yeah.
stories around these gods?
I think probably the most influential story about a storm god is a story that was associated with various storm gods, but has one and is told in various different ways, but has one basic common narrative element, and that is the story of the storm god, who is a young warrior god and has to prove his basically his fitness for the royal office to become king of the gods, and does that by defeating the most powerful enemy of the ruling gods of heaven, and that in a tradition that probably originates in northern Syria and is attested to us explicitly for the first time in the early second millennium, is a story about the storm god defeating the sea, the salt sea, and winning kingship by defeating the sea and defeating the most powerful enemy of the gods. And this is embedded. This story is embedded in various different settings and associated with different storm gods. Um, you have we know that it was told about the storm god of Aleppo in the early second millennium already. It was told about the Hurrian storm god Teshub, and there it became part of a whole set of stories that deal with Teshub, the storm god, becoming king of the gods, and his father, Kumarbi, who is a god of grain and the earth, fighting him for it. And that is a set of stories that begins with a, a sequence of generations of divine kings. A god called Alalu first, then a sky god Anu, who is king of the gods, and this god Anu is then fought by his son Kumarbi, who defeats Anu, who has to flee, and Kumarbi wants to kill him, but only can grab his his leg and then bites off his genitals and swallows up the genitals of his father Anu. And Anu looks back to his son and says, "Well, Kumarbi, good luck with that. And now I've made you pregnant with the most powerful gods." And indeed, Kumarbi develops a terrible headache. And from his head spring powerful gods, and among them the storm god Teshub. And Teshub then defeats Kumarbi. And then a whole range of stories deals with various attempts of Kumarbi to regain kingship, and the storm god defeating him and the sea then also in that context. And there the victory of the storm god of the sea becomes part of this whole cycle of stories that were then very influential in the Mediterranean. Similar stories about Zeus defeating Typhon and so on, or you find it in Psalms occasionally that God is defeating the sea and proving his might by that. These are all, well, branches of the same tree, I would say, of traditions which we cannot follow in detail, but which originates probably already in the third millennium in Syria. And the other most famous god who's associated with this victory of the sea is the god Baal or Baalu in Ugarit. And in the Ugaritic myths, which are attested in the Ugaritic cuneiform script, and it was a huge sensation when these texts were found in the mid 20th century. because for the first time we had in alphabetic script mythological texts, devotional texts that were very directly related
Mm,
to things that we knew from the Hebrew Bible.
mm,
Um, and there's a set of myths that a set of stories about the main gods of the city of Ugarit on the Syrian Mediterranean coast today. And a part of that set of myths is how the young god, warlike god Balu, or Baal, the storm god, um, gains kingship by beating the god Yamu or Yam, the god of the sea. And there again, the storm god defeats the sea, becomes the king of the gods, and then has a palace for himself built. And there in Ugarit, it is connected with a motif that we can also find connected with various storm gods. Not always that are the text complete enough to really understand what is going on, but the the Middle Eastern seasons have only certain parts of the year where you have extensive rainfall, and
mm,
during the summer there's very, very little rainfall or no rainfall at all, and there's a dry period. And this had an influence, or was that there are explanations for this in the stories that were told about storm gods. And for Baal in Ugarit, uh, it is explained that there is the story that he not only has to fight the sea, the god Yamu, but he also has to fight divine death, the god Motu or Mot, and is defeated by death. And the god Baal dies, has to descend to the netherworld for some time, and only comes up from the netherworld again because his sister Anat, a young violent, warlike girl, defeats the death, the god Motu, and allows Baal to be reinstated, and then rain returns. And this seasonal pattern is reflected in several different regions of the ancient Near East in stories
mm.
about the storm god who for some time is absent,
Huh.
apparently. And this was imagined as maybe a period of imprisonment and or even temporary death, not in the sense that we die and we do not resurrect,
Mm,
at least not within a year, and but that the cyclical pattern of the seasons had a profound influence on the stories that were told about these gods who were considered responsible for rainfall.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. So, if I'm an ancient person and I'm writing a text like that, am I thinking that when it's raining, that literally, or literally whatever that means, that, there's a storm god out there and that's what I'm thinking of? Or how does an ancient person portray that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that in principle, I think the text suggests to us that in principle, the people in the cultures that we're studying in the ancient Near East thought and saw in the natural phenomena that they associated with these deities. They saw in them also the deities. So the
Hmm.
sun in the sky was the sun god, and it was present in the sky and at the same time in the temple next door, and possibly even in a little shrine outside the city on a road. And for them, that wasn't a difficulty conceiving that. And like the
Hmm.
sun is visible in the sun, like that, the storm god would be present and visible in rainfall, in thunder. Thunder is described as the shouting, the screaming of the storm god, or the trampling of his animals. Um, they would without then always making too much of fuss about it, I imagine, they would certainly conceive of these natural phenomena as manifestations of divinities. And how virulent that was in their thought at a given point in their life
Mm-hmm.
was certainly different. I mean, if it was spring and there was normal rain, yeah, you would be happy that this is going on, but maybe you wouldn't
Mm.
think of the storm god Adad all the time, and you had more urgent business. I don't know. Maybe you had to buy a field, or your cow was dying, or whatever, or you were preparing a military campaign if you were the king. So these are not things that are present all the time in the same way, but certainly if there's a violent storm and the temple is destroyed by lightning, then yes, then you would tell you, if you're the king, you would tell your scholars, please get the prayers to the storm god, because apparently we have
Yeah.
to do something. He seems to be very angry with us. But that is actually not so foreign to us. If we're religious people, our
Mm.
religiosity is not active in the same intensity in every second of our life
Mm.
and in every phase of our life. And that was certainly not different in ancient times.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. So, so what's going on in current scholarship? What are some recent finds? There's a really interesting one you mentioned, how water's not only from above. Can you talk about that and the new finds that we're getting out?
Yeah. Well, what one text that I came across, thanks to a colleague who deciphered it first and brought it to my knowledge, is actually a Sumerian hymn to the storm god Ishkur, in from the early second millennium, from what is today southern Iraq, and that's a text that is yet unpublished, but it's nice because it describes Ishkur in such a nice explicit way that gives a vivid image of what people associated with this god. Maybe I can read just a passage from that unpublished text to give you
Sure. Could you repeat
a
that
flavor.
part? Could you repeat that one more time? It looks like there was some background noise for some reason.
Oh, okay. From when on?
Right after you mentioned that it's from Ishkur, or it's to Ishkur. I mean, so basically the whole thing. Sorry.
Okay, but there is this. How do I start again? Uh, so one of the
Yeah.
recent discoveries, new things, things that which is sort of typical of new texts that are discovered, is a Sumerian hymn to Ishkur, the Sumerian storm god from the early second millennium, and its introduction describes very vividly the storm god and what he's doing and why he's addressed in this prayer and hymn. And maybe I just read from the translation of
Yeah.
this
Let's do it.
text to
Yeah.
give you an impression of what these texts sound like.
Okay.
So it begins with, O Ishkur, hero at whose roaring heaven and land quake, who hurls his head in his flaring storm, flashing with lightning in heaven and earth, holding the office of the canal inspector of the gods, providing sustenance for all. Enlil and Ninlil, these are his parents in this text. Enlil and Ninlil magnificently endowed Ishkur with the capacity to bring up the thick clouds from the earth into the skies, to cover the earth with heavy fog, to make it rain on the fields, to raise water from the base of the mountain ranges, to add flooding in the rivers, to water the furrows on the fields with his hand, to make the greenery and the garlic sprout, to make the harvest abundant, to prevent anyone from destroying the harvest, to make the plants in the earth truly grow, to let the green growth, as much as there is on the field, come forth from the earth, to have the fish, the abundance of the underground waters, open their mouth for his rain, to place in its midst the fish spawn, to bring forth fish in abundance, to establish plenty everywhere, and so
Hmm.
on. So that is a description from southern Iraq, where it doesn't rain a lot. And I find it interesting that, nevertheless, of course, people were aware of what rain can do when it happens. And they were aware that it rains in the mountains and that rain is stored as snow, and then the annual spring flood of the rivers Euphrates and Tigris is due in the end to rainfall. And they make these connections and then associate it with this God. And in this clarity, we knew that in any case, but in this clarity and this kind of description for the first time we have in this text. And it's not the typical image of Sumerian Ishkur, sort of the dust storm that we have, that who tramples the fields and is destructive. But here it's a more nuanced picture that shows that the horizon of these people in what is today southern Iraq reached far beyond their immediate environment, but they can what was reflected in this text is a wider understanding of the world and how things are interconnected. I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
the other
yeah,
yeah
go for it. Keep going.
no the other discovery that lies back a few years, but is really fascinating, or was fascinating at the time in the early 2000s, was the discovery of the archaeological remains of the Temple of the Storm God on the citadel in Aleppo. And it's also, I mean, now I haven't been to the citadel of Aleppo since the earthquake and since the war, but it has been heavily affected both by the war and by the earthquake. So I'm not sure what the situation there is, but Kai Kohlmeier, a German archaeologist, published the archaeological evidence and could show that actually, as we knew from the text, the building of this temple reaches far back into the third millennium, and he could recover um, the early first millennium, late second millennium temple, and found reliefs that of the courtyard and the inner sanctum of the temple with a depiction of the storm god. And that was one of the very fascinating new discoveries when I wrote my dissertation on storm gods, that finally this temple that is present in written sources from the mid third millennium into the Greco-Roman period is actually something that we can well visit and hopefully can visit again in the future.
Wow. Yeah, that's really really cool stuff. All right. And one more thing here. What about the Tarhunta statue from Adana?
Yeah, but if you want to look at a monumental statue of the storm god as it was imagined in the first half of the first millennium BC, in the 8th century BC, then there is now one monumental statue which was discovered in recent years, actually by chance, near a village called Çineköy uh, um, in the Adana region in southern Turkey. And it's today in the Adana Museum, in the Archaeological Museum of Adana. And it shows a monumental storm god standing there, uh, I think more than 2 meters high in stone, with a chariot in stone drawn by two stone bulls. So the whole pictorial program, iconographic program of the storm god
Mm,
at that period in that region, and is there in monumental size, discovered by chance. So we don't know the exact archaeological wider context, but certainly part of a sanctuary or temple, and inscribed with an inscription by a king called Varikas, who ruled at that time in the area, in the land that he called Chiava, but it's basically the area of Cilicia, the area of Adana, where he
mm,
ruled. And what is interesting about this statue is not only that it's so monumental, and if listeners want to look at it, there's a wonderful website called Hittite Monuments, done by my colleague Tayfun Bilgin, and there's a map, and you press on Çinekö, and you can see wonderful pictures of it.
Oh wow.
And on this monument, there are also inscriptions, and inscriptions on the one hand in what we call hieroglyphic Luwian. Luwian is a language closely related to Hittite, and in the early first millennium, this language was spoken in southern Anatolia and northern Syria, and also in Phoenician, because that was the other language that was spoken at that time in that area, Phoenician and Luwian. And there we can also see how the same storm god has two different names. In the Phoenician inscription, he's called Baal, and in the Luwian inscription, he's called Tachunta or Tachunza. And that in one monument, you have here, so to say, the argument with which we started, that yes, you can just follow one name and study only a god called X. But actually, in ancient times, gods of the same type were connected with each other, and the names coming from the different linguistic traditions served, so to
Mm.
say, as translations of each other. And if a Luwian person in southern Anatolia in the 8th century called that god Tachunza, there was no problem with the Phoenician colleague next door calling him Baal. That wasn't a theological problem. These were just two different languages or two different names in two different languages for what the two of them certainly would consider the same God that there stands in front of us, 2 meters tall, or even taller. I'm not sure how big the statue is. It's a bit damaged, but it is still very impressive. And if you come to Adana one day, certainly go there and visit the storm god.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I'll definitely have to if I'm ever in the area. So, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure a lot of people got a lot out of this. Really interesting stuff to have someone of your expertise on here that can give us some more information. Thank you so much for coming on here. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Anything you'd like to share with my audience? Maybe your work or anything like that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. It was a real pleasure talking about this topic and related issues. If people want to read more along these lines, they can get access to most of my publications on my academia.edu page or on the website at Würzburg University. And well, feel free to drop me an email if you really get into it and want to discuss issues. Thank you for
Awesome.
having me.
Awesome. Yes, it's an absolute pleasure. All right. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Mhm.